Thank you for having me. That was a very inspiring lead-in from David. That was really some pretty good role models to look up to.
So I'm actually going to maybe switch our first question, if that's okay.
Sure.
You said that would be fine, because I think just to sort of build on what we heard here, one of the important things that we were talking about is importance of values in business. And this is totally off script, but how does that inspire you? I mean, why do you think it's important today for Etsy to really live out its values, and how is the company doing that?
Yeah, I mean, great question. You know, we've spent a lot of time at Etsy thinking about it, and in fact, just yesterday we rolled out our new values. And the first place we started with is the word values is interesting because values are personal and they're inherent. And so each of us needs to show up at work with the values that we believe in and be willing to stand for those. And then what we ended up laying out for the company was guiding principles, which we think are collective and active, which is something that we can all agree on, regardless of the political spectrum that we come from or religious or social views that we have. And I'm well aware that in my company, we have a very diverse range of political, social, and religious views. And in our community of 2 million sellers and 37 million buyers, we have a very diverse range of viewpoints. And I want to make sure that we create a safe space for people to come together and bring their full selves into our community. But it's also important that each of us as leaders do stand for something. And I don't think there's some idea that we can leave that at home when we come to the office. I just don't think that's possible. We're each our full selves. And so I was very inspired by many of the examples, all of the examples that David gave. There were so many really inspiring moments there where people stood out and said that what's going on in the world, which may or may not directly impact my business, is important, and I need to take a stand. And I think we have to allow our corporate leaders to do that. But I also think that those moments are incredibly courageous and incredibly important. We spend 99% of our time building our business in our day job. So I think one of the things that I've thought about each time, you know, in the various roles I've been in, is what in this company, what in this business model inspires me, and how comfortable and confident am I that the mission of this company is actually social action in a way that I think is important. And so I guess getting to the sort of new blueprint for business, I guess that's what I ask myself, and what I would expect leaders would ask is, my day job should be a social mission. I should believe that my business does that. And if not, you should ask yourself maybe a different set of questions, right? But this notion that over here I'm going to build a business, and then we're going to sort of make up for it by having a corporate social responsibility team, I just think that's outdated. It isn't even the right word, because I'm not sure there was ever a time that that was okay. But maybe we're all more cognizant of it.
So social mission would be a key part of the new blueprint for business. And I think then another aspect of that is really the impact that you're having. You know, so you have that mission, but what does that really mean?
Yeah.
So impact is also something that is important for Etsy. And with BSR, we work together to develop an integrated value creation model, which talks about how Etsy creates value in the business, the community, the ecosystem. Can you tell us a little bit about that model and how you think about it?
Yeah, and BSR was a fantastic partner in helping us think through it. And the word you started with, your team will remember, I kept coming back to over and over and over again, which is the word impact. It's not about intentions, because intentions are great, but it's how do you translate intentions into action in order to have impact. That's, at the end of the day, the only thing that matters. So we started with our mission, and we started by spending time on what is Etsy's mission, and we got to 3 simple but powerful words. So our mission is keeping commerce human. Keeping commerce human. And I personally feel that that day job is incredibly important. And we've got to be all in on that. So what does that mean? Well, in a world where automation is changing the nature of work, for so many people, when we look at the distress that's being felt across this country and around the world, I think a core contributor is that automation is changing the nature of work. And what Etsy does is it allows people to take their creative energy. Creativity can't be automated. How do I take my creative energy and turn that into a way to provide for my family? And I think that's really relevant. I think that's really important. The second piece of keeping commerce human is how do I allow for a buyer and a maker to meet and co-create together sometimes, but to have a real exchange in a way that's very human. And almost every purchase on Etsy involves a conversation between the buyer and the maker. And in a world that's ever more commoditized, that's ever more anonymous, that's ever more automated, I think this idea that people from often different parts of the country or different parts of the world are meeting and having an exchange, which starts with often commerce. And when you look at the exchanges happening between the buyers and the makers, may start with commercial exchange and quickly leads to much bigger conversations. I think that's also really important. So that's our mission. But then, if you're going to take Milton Friedman's, the role of a business is to generate profit, it still leads how? How do you generate profit? And we have many options for how we do that. So what we worked on together is, given that our mission is keeping commerce human, and given that impact matters, we should be able to measure the impact and hold ourselves accountable to it. And this, we think, is a really core principle, that if you are a socially responsible company, you've got to hold yourself to a higher bar in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency. It's not a way to let yourself off the hook and say, oh, we're socially responsible, and therefore, it's okay that our profits aren't doing as well or our revenues aren't doing as well. No, you've got to find a way to make the pie bigger for everyone. If what social responsibility is I'm just going to take the same size pie and I'm going to cut a bigger slice for one stakeholder at the expense of others, I just don't see how we progress that way. I think that's very challenging. The question is, how do we use social responsibility to make the pie bigger for everyone? So that's what we worked on together. And what we found was that really there's three areas that we want to hold ourselves accountable for and be transparent and report out on that matter in the broader ecosystem. It's economic empowerment, it's diversity, and it's environmental impact. Starting with economic empowerment, that is our day job. So the number one metric by which we measure success at Etsy is what we call gross merchandise sales, GMS, which is just a fancy word for the total value of all the things bought on Etsy. Now, that's not our revenue. Our revenue is a different number. Revenue's our commission on that. But gross merchandise sales, or GMS, is the size of the pie. How many sales have our makers generated? Which translates into what kind of income do they have to support their family. So that's the metric by which we hold ourselves accountable. We recently published a study saying that we did in 2017 about $3.3 billion of gross merchandise sales. But we had about 4 points, and that was around the world. Looking at just the US portion of that, we had about $4.7 billion of economic impact. And the reason is that our makers had to buy raw materials. They sometimes hired other people to help them in their process. They paid state and local sales taxes, and so they created jobs around them in addition to the work that they did themselves and the income that they earned. And our work with BSR helped us think about how to measure that and this idea of what is the total economic impact that we're creating. So that's the first, is economic impact. But how do we get there? We believe, I believe passionately, that we must have a diverse workforce in order to succeed. We must have empathy with a broad range of customers, and the only way to do that well is to have a very diverse workforce. And so we measure ourselves and report out on the diversity of our workforce, and we want to make sure that we have best-in-class metrics there. So I'm very proud of the fact that we have, starting at the top, a balanced board. 50% of our board is non-male. We also have worked on adding diversity and other metrics to our other perspectives to our board. More than half of our leadership team is female. 32% of our engineers are female, which is more than double the industry average. And I think that's important because 87% of our makers are women. And a roughly comparable portion of our buyers are women. So it's really important that we have very strong representation at all levels from women in the company. But in people of color, we need to do better. We want to keep doing better with gender representation as well. But I think we need more focus on people of color. As we really looked at our diversity metrics, we said that's an area where we're not as, we haven't made as much progress. And so we're putting a lot of focus into that right now. So diversity, we think, is really important, and it will make the pie bigger as we succeed there. The third metric is environmental impact, and we believe that we can be a very successful business and do that while lightening our environmental footprint. And so we've set bold aspirations around that. We've said that we want to use 100% renewable energy by 2020. In 2017, we published that we have 30% renewable energy in 2017. We want to get to 100 by 2020, and I think we're going to get there. And a big part of that is holding ourselves accountable and publishing our metrics. We are working towards 100% diversion of waste away from landfills. We're about 90% in our Brooklyn office right now, and around the world close to that, and getting better. And we want to get to 100% in the next couple of years in landfill diversion as well. So working together, we decided there's 3 areas. It's economic empowerment, it's diversity, and it's environmental footprint. And then if we're serious about it, which we are, we better decide how we're going to measure that, and then be transparent about publishing those metrics, and then hold ourselves accountable to do better. And it was great work with BSR to help us to clarify and define that.
Thank you, thank you. I think it would be nice for us to maybe bring to life a little bit this idea of keeping commerce human. So you've got a little video.
Yeah. So, you know, I think for talking with my team about the mission, it's one thing to have leadership talk about the mission. It's much more important when stakeholders talk about the mission. And so one thing that we do is once a month we have an all hands. And in every all hands, we start by having one of our makers talk, so that our employees hear directly from the people they serve about why the work we do is important to them. So we brought a video from Diane Nort, who runs a farm in Virginia, talking about her Etsy business.
I think about my sheep like 24 hours a day. What makes my blanket special is that there's an animal husbandry side of what I do. Right now I have 46 sheep. So we've got Eddie and Rudy, Cricket and Joan, Jane, and then there's Teddy. I raise the sheep and keep them their whole lives, and the wool is grown here on our farm. I'll go out in the morning and tend to the animals, trimming their feed, feeding them, shearing them once a year. When I'm dyeing wool, I use all plant dyes. It is a full-time job. I grew up on a farm and then went to college and studied fashion design, thinking I wanted to go to a big city, and by the end of college I just had decided that weaving was what I wanted to do, and having a sheep farm and raising my own wool was my goal. Since Etsy came along, it's revolutionized crafting because it reaches a real worldwide audience. I could be here at home, work from my basement, and I can reach a customer that's all over the world. It's pretty exciting. We are living in a time when people care about where their food and their items, their crafts come from. The blankets are woven on a traditional loom without electricity. Everything is powered by my hands and feet. This is what I imagined when I was in college and I started to think about farm life.
So, you know, you take that sweater and you put it on Amazon on a list with 500 other sweaters, it's just a sweater. It needs the opportunity to tell the story. And you know, Etsy's a special platform for that, and we take that responsibility very seriously. So Diane doesn't have an easy life. You know, she doesn't get to wake up when she wants and have a great 401k plan and, you know, all the other things. Like, it's hard. And so we at Etsy take that very seriously, that we've got to show up every day too, and we've got to bring our A game. we've got to be great because she's counting on us. And we've got to execute and deliver every day just the way that she does.
That's great. I want to come back to something you talked about, which was diversity and gender diversity in technology. So you have a great track record there. Can you tell us a little more and maybe just some of the really practical things you've learned along the way for the companies in the room?
Yeah, we are at Etsy very proud of the gender diversity that we have, but I think it's just important for us to be successful. And on my previous teams too, I'm proud. We've had a pretty good track record. But you know, I would say there's not a silver bullet to it. I think that's the first thing. I would acknowledge that there has been a sustained commitment to gender diversity at Etsy for 14 years. We're 14 years old, and since the day we were born, there has been a commitment to it. So I don't think you suddenly wake up and get a very diverse team overnight. It requires sustained commitment over time, and it requires commitment at all levels, but especially at the top. So some of the things that you're all going to be familiar with, obviously people looking up and seeing people who look like them and represent them at the boardroom, I think is important. At the senior executive team is obviously very important. And we've done things there, I think, to show commitment. So, for example, making sure that we have diverse slates and diverse panels. We hold jobs open. Important jobs that are urgent to fill, we will hold open. Until we make sure that we've seen a really diverse slate of candidates to make sure that we're getting the best and building diversity in the team. And I think that it's the team seeing that we're willing to do the hard things that helps them feel like we have a commitment. But it's also a lot of little things. So we hired a firm called Paradigm Consulting. They did a fantastic job. I really recommend them. And they came and did a full audit of our pipeline. So I asked, it's a process like everything else, a recruiting process. So let's talk about recruiting and promotion, because those are the two things that matter, right? Who do you bring into the company, and then does everyone have an equal chance to succeed and be rewarded in the company? And in recruiting, they did a full audit from how do we present ourselves to the employee community, to our interview process all along the way, and it was fascinating. They had a whole set of recommendations. But for example, when you think at the very beginning of the pipeline, writing your job specs and posting your job specs, well, they had great feedback for us. It turns out that on average, and these are always generalizations, but on average, women are likely to look at a set of requirements, and if they don't check every single box, they will not apply. Men are a little more forgiving of themselves, on average. And so thinking about all the things you have listed as requirements, and are they truly requirements or not? And skinnying down the requirements to only those that are true requirements has been helpful. And as we've done that, we've seen more diversity at the front of the pipeline. Thinking about who you have represented on your website turns out to make a big difference. But then thinking about our interview panels, and how do we get really structured in our interview process and our interview panels to remove bias and get crisper in the real competencies that we're really looking for. We've done a lot of training, and we've worked a lot on process, and we are seeing that have a very significant and powerful impact. And we're hiring better people, because we're really focused just on the competencies that matter the most. One thing that's been great in engineering is really well suited for coding challenges. You give someone a coding challenge and see the quality of their output. And we tend to be colored by things like what school you went to and other things that are interesting, but not necessarily predictive. And by the way, also have a lot of bias built into them. The output of our higher education institutions is not as representative of our total population. And so by thinking about taking competency-based challenges, and what we found is by moving them earlier in the process, we actually get more diverse candidates and more diverse employees. We've also looked a lot at the rigor of our performance management processes and made sure we've done a lot of training around bias, training and focus around data, and really bringing data into the room as we look at the all-important decisions, which is really who gets promoted, who gets recognized and rewarded, and who doesn't. That's really where your culture lives and dies. And I'm really pleased with the results of that. You know, in our most recent round of performance reviews. We took a pause. After the data came in, we took a pause and looked at would any of the demographic data predict outcomes, and it doesn't, which is important. It's the right answer, but we made sure that that was true before we moved forward. And I think that was a result of a lot of training that we did of the team and a big focus on using data to make those decisions. So I do think it's attention to detail all the way through, and it's intention. And I think seeing real commitment and intention from leadership, I think, matters a lot.
Tell us a little bit about Code Nation. So this is outside of Etsy, but related as well.
Huge passion point for me. So, you know, when we look at diversity, and I'm going to talk for a minute particularly about technology. I'm sure it's probably true in many other industries, but I spent most of my career in technology. We need more diversity in our company, and I think in the whole technology industry. And we have a real pipeline problem. So there are very few people of color in the technology industry as compared to the total population. And if you look at the pipeline, it starts in K-12. So relatively few schools provide access to computer science education. And if you don't get some coding education by the time you graduate college, you are very unlikely to study computer science in college. And computer science is the most sought after skill in the United States right now. Average starting incomes of north of $80,000 a year. These are great jobs. And right now the technology industry's solution to our huge labor shortage is immigration reform. And while I'm a big fan of supporting people from all over the world, and there's talent all over the world, boy, couldn't we do a better job with the people that we have right here in the United States. So it's got to start with K through 12 and making sure that every student in America has access to computer science education before they graduate high school. I think that's critical. And if you think about showing up in your first 2 years of college, it's mostly core curriculum, right? You get maybe 1 or 2 electives. How many students are going to raise their hand and sign up for computer science in their freshman year if they've never taken it before? That seems really scary. But by the time you get to junior year, it's too late. There's too many classes in most computer science departments to begin as a junior. So we've got to get them exposed. And shockingly, in most states in the United States, computer science doesn't even count for credit. And in relatively few schools is it offered. Now, in under-resourced schools, it's particularly not offered. It's very rare to see a computer science class in an under-resourced school. You might see something that says computer science, but it's word processing or how to use Excel or something like that. It's not actual coding. Why? Well, there's a couple of challenges. One is most states haven't decided that this should count for credit. That's a challenge. But 2, it's really hard to train a teacher to do that. And if you do, she's suddenly way more valuable and she gets a job for twice the money in the private sector. So not only is it really hard to train them, but it's really hard to retain them. One of the things that I've learned in my journey with Code Nation is that training students to code is necessary, but far from sufficient to provide a pathway for under-resourced students to come into the technology workforce. They simply don't have the social capital. No one they know works in tech. And for affluent people, we all have some connection to the technology industry. Someone who can make a phone call, someone who can tell you how to work on a resume, someone who can tell you what the dress code is. There are so many things that we take for granted that these students don't have. So at Code Nation, our model is we take volunteers who go and spend 100 hours with our students in the classroom. These are adults who code for a living, who come into inner city classrooms and teach coding. And Code Nation provides them the curriculum and support to teach. But what they do is not only teach coding, but they actually also work on things like how do you get a GitHub account, which is what any employer in a tech company is want to look at. Let me look at your code samples in your GitHub account. All the mentoring, all the social capital is critical. And I think where I'm going with this is I think it's got to be a public-private partnership. I don't think that government alone. First, government has to do more. Our school system has to do more, but it can't do it alone. Industry, technology companies, technology leaders have to be involved, and we've got to build the pipeline.
Interestingly, so I'm based in our BSR Paris office, and I learned that France has now passed a requirement that all elementary school kids take a coding class. So that's,
As
quite
England,
progressive.
have
So my
had
daughter will
many
be doing
other-
that, yeah.
The US is behind.
Yeah.
The US is behind. We're deeply concerned with manufacturing jobs, but we're not focused on the $100,000 a year plus jobs, which there's more than 1 million open jobs right now we cannot fill in this country. And we produce about 170,000 computer science graduates in total from all of the universities in all of the United States combined. There's no way that supply will keep up with the demand. The other really cool thing about, if I can for a sec on coding, sorry, it's just a big passion of mine, is you don't necessarily need to have gone to college. Now, going to college can be a great thing, and if you get into a good school, it's fantastic. But about half the kids who start in a 4-year university fail to graduate in 6 years right now, and they're racking up a lot of student debt. And coding is something you can actually learn and be really good at without necessarily racking up a lot of debt and taking yourself out of the labor market for years and years. And not all families have the resources to go and do that. And so if someone has aptitude and passion for this, there's ways to get training and get really good at it without necessarily investing years of your life and racking up a ton of debt. And then I think we as employers need to recognize the competency-based interviews and pay maybe a little bit less attention to some of the degrees and other things we use as proxies for that.
Yeah, good. I want to let the audience know that in about 8 minutes we'll be taking questions. So just start thinking about that, but also send them via Twitter. So hashtag BSR18. That was my PSA. Switching gears a little bit, Josh, you are publicly traded.
Yeah.
Has that hindered your ability to really focus on impact? I mean, you've had some pressure from activist shareholders and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and how you approach it?
Yeah. I think that being public has been very helpful in our social impact. I'm going to go out on a limb on that and say that. Because it forces us to be accountable. And I think accountability is a great thing. I think that having to be transparent and report out on how you do is healthy. We all do better when we're held to account. And I think if you're a socially responsible company, you got to hold yourself to a higher standard in terms of your execution and in terms of your output. Now, if your business model says that what I do for a living is maybe not that great, but I'm going to take a piece of that pie and spend it over here to try to make up for it and be a better social citizen, that's a pretty hard business model. And I can imagine, again, taking the same size pie and just cutting a bigger share for one stakeholder at the expense of another. That is a pretty tough argument. I don't think that's sustainable whether you're public or private, though. You know, I mean, there was a lot of conversation about Etsy and whether being public was bad for us. And, you know, I had some very candid conversations with my team. I said, look, in the other part of my life, I'm the chairman of this thing called Codation, which I'm kind of passionate about. And my role basically is to beg for money for a living. That's what I do for CodeNation. I go and beg for money. And we at CodeNation spend every penny so carefully because someone reached into their pocket and they gave it to us. We hold ourselves so accountable to outcomes as a result of that. So don't think that somehow being a not-for-profit makes you not accountable. I think not-for-profits are the most accountable. It's hard. My team is amazing. Our team at CodeNation is amazing, and they work really hard for relatively much less pay than they would make in the private sector. And if you're a private company, you still have a shareholder somewhere. So when I look at Etsy, you know, we invest about $300 million a year in our community, and we're only 14 years old. If we were a not-for-profit, that would be quite remarkable to be investing $300 million a year. There's not a lot of not-for-profits that have the resources to invest that. Why are we able to invest over $300 million a year in this great social mission we care about? Because we have a sustainable business model. Because we have a sustainable business model. And if we were not a successful company, nobody would want to follow us. So I do think that to the extent we hold ourselves to a higher standard and do a good job with diversity and environmental impact, people will say, wow, your stock is doing pretty well and your market cap is really good. How did you do that? And I say, let me tell you about our really diverse team, and let me tell you why we make better decisions, why we're more imaginative, why we connect with our customer better because of the diversity of our team. Let me tell you why being environmentally, trying our best and getting better and better on our environmental impact has been good for us. That's a conversation suddenly we can have, but it starts with being successful as a business.
Let's just come back a little bit. So you mentioned $300 million investment in community.
Yeah.
What is that comprised of?
Yeah, so there's basically two things we do. The first is we try to build a platform that allows buyers and sellers to meet, which maybe sounds kind of easy, but to give you a sense of scale, we have 2 million makers who sell about 50 million items. And the only thing those items have in common is that they don't have anything in common. They don't map to a catalog. So unlike Amazon, which sells a bunch of commodities that can all be mapped to a catalog, these are 50 million individual things, handmade things. And we've got to create a search engine and a discovery experience that makes sense of that. And then imbue trust on 2 million makers you've never met. You're now going to go buy something from someone you've never met. So we've got to create an experience that gives you trust. And so there's a whole set of technology and tech challenges we face that are really hard and really interesting to do that. The second thing we do is we market. Our makers have hired us to market them. That's our job. And so, we spend, well north of $100 million a year on marketing and trying to make sure that people are aware and buying their products.
Tell us a little bit about your role then in the gig economy.
Yeah.
So, at the end of the day, can we not say, okay, on the one hand, there's great coding jobs, but is this sort of emergence of strengthening of the gig economy just also exacerbating inequality?
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Great question. So look, I think we are evolving more and more to a gig economy in kind of every way. And I do think that Etsy is emblematic of a form of a gig economy, right? We have people who take their careers into their own hands and create a business on Etsy. And by the way, there's millions of people in the gig economy right now. What I'm proud of with Etsy is we are a platform for people to create their own business. They decide what product they want to make. They decide how they want to price it. They decide how many hours they want to spend and what value they're going to get for that. So we are a platform for entrepreneurship. And about half of the makers on Etsy say the first thing they ever sold, they sold on Etsy. So they have a tremendous amount of agency on our platform to build their own business and scale it as far as they can take it. There is no ceiling on Etsy. So we feel really good about that. It is true that there are more and more gig economy workers in the United States and around the world, and I think that is a trend that is going to continue. So our social safety net needs to think about that. How are we making sure that everyone has access to health insurance? Those kinds of things. Is tax policy fair for gig economy workers? Those kinds of things are really important. And so, our advocacy team takes very seriously advocating for micro businesses and making sure that we're looking out for gig economy workers and trying to build a better world in which they can thrive.
Yeah. What are some of the sort of big challenges at the moment in that? Because you are quite active from the sort of regulatory policy perspective to support this community of makers.
A couple. I do think health for everyone in this country, health insurance is a big problem. You never would have woken up and designed the healthcare system that we have today. It arrived this way by itself, but it certainly wasn't designed this way. There are many gaps in it that particularly gig economy employees or gig economy members could fall through. So that's a challenge. We're also seeing a lot of state level regulation, state tax policy that is not helpful. So for example, just recently there have been some court cases so that states can tax gig economy members. And I get the need for states to generate more tax revenue, and they're looking for ways to do that, and I understand it. What's tough for a gig economy member is, let's take an Etsy seller, for example. She's usually working from her home. She's a business of one, and suddenly 50 different states and 10,000 different tax jurisdictions each want to impose their own tax code on her. And that becomes just an unmanageable burden on very small businesses. You know, if you're a big corporation, you can have a whole team of people in your tax department that can figure that out. But it's just not viable. So what we need is federal level solutions that simplify things. We need to generate tax revenues for our municipal, state, and federal government. We need to do that. But let's do that fairly, and let's try to do that in a way that's as simple as possible so that small businesses have a fair chance as well.
Thank you. We're going to take some questions from the audience or from Twitter. Is there anyone in the audience first who has a question? All right, see when we have mics over here.
Hi, good morning. Here, I'll stand up. Mary Engvall, I'm with Cigna, so I'd love to talk about the health insurance piece of it more. Specifically, my question is, clearly the makers are such an incredible stakeholder group, and I'm just wondering, in terms of the environmental footprint of their work, how much you do, both to kind of oversee and manage that, but also to help them with that.
Yeah, great question. So a couple of things. You know, we do feel good about the fact that many of our makers are using locally sourced products, and so there's less shipping and transportation. It's a lot of more recycled things, so there's less ending up in landfill. But we do look at our entire ecosystem, and the biggest challenge in that is shipping. In e-commerce in general, shipping is the big challenge in our environmental footprint, and that's a big challenge. Now, if we let big challenges paralyze us, we wouldn't get anywhere. So we started with, what can we affect today? And we started with the simplest thing, which is our office. And we said, we can affect the impact in our office. So let's get to 100% renewable energy use and 100% landfill diversion in our own offices. Let's start there, because it's a place to start. And we've made great progress there, and we're on our way. By the way, we've done some things in our offices to really try to pioneer what smaller companies can do. So getting pedal certified with LBC, we were the first company of our size to get pedal certified with LBC, and that now bigger and bigger companies are following, saying, oh, that is something that appears to be economically viable. Let me look at it. And we're seeing bigger and bigger companies now do that. We're proud of that. The second thing we looked at is our server farms. Now, our server farms are big energy consumers, and they get bigger as we grow. That's the next challenge. So we looked at how we can fix that, and we're very proud of the fact that we signed our own power purchase agreement together with Apple and Akamai and Swiss Re, where that will get us to 100% renewable energy in our server farms. And what we think is particularly compelling is that we're relatively small to have our own PPA. This is only a 4.5 megawatt deal. So it also started to pave the way for the fact that smaller companies can do PPAs. And we're seeing now other people ask, well, how do we do that? And we're excited about that. We are moving to the cloud, and we chose Google as our cloud provider. And one important consideration was that they share our commitment to renewable energy and have committed to the fact that our servers will be powered through renewable energy with Google. The next thing then is shipping. And that's the next thing we got to figure out how to tackle. And we are hoping that with battery-powered cars and other lower emission transportation solutions, we can help figure out how through the supply chain we can have some impact and see the environmental impact of our shipping go down as well.
Other questions?
Hi, Josh.
Hey, David.
Excuse me. Hi, everyone. It's very loud. I think that's better. I think everyone in this room is looking for ways to systematize and validate some of these efforts.
Yeah.
And one of those ways, of course, is being a B Corp
Yeah.
and B Labs. When I wrote about the company almost a year ago to the week, You were new to your tenure, but one of the many changes you had made was essentially letting your B Corp certification lapse.
Yeah.
If it is the case that you have become, as you say, more socially responsible over the last year and a half, why is it that you needed to let that certification lapse? And can you explain your decision?
Absolutely. So B Corp was very helpful to us in the early days as we were trying to figure out how to measure and get better. One of B Corp's requirements is that if you are a public company, you must recertify as a B Corp. So we are a C Corp, and this is now, I'm just talking legalese here, but we are incorporated in the state of Delaware as a C Corp. And we needed to go back to the state of Delaware and re-incorporate as a B Corp. And that requires a vote of 75% of our shareholders. And in my candid opinion, there was a 0.0% chance that we were going to get 75% of our shareholders to do that. So it wasn't an option. But more importantly, what that says is that we do not think we can be a socially conscious company and be a C Corp. And if that's true, I think we got big problems. And I passionately believe it is not true. I passionately believe we can be a great citizen and a great business at the same time. One does not need to come at the expense of the other. And that is really key. What would the message be? We need to change our incorporation from a C to a B Corp. Why would we not get 75% of shareholders to vote yes? Because we would be saying that in order to be socially responsible, it needs to come at your expense, implicitly. And I don't believe that. And I think we're going to show that. And I think we are on our way to showing that we are, an ever better business and more socially responsible, and we're doing it as a C Corp. You saw Larry Fink talk about how he really cares. He really gives a hoot about the social responsibility of the companies in which BlackRock invests. And they're one of the biggest investors in the world. I have many investors ask me about our social responsibility efforts because they know that it matters in terms of attracting and retaining great talent these days, because they know that customers increasingly pay attention to this, because they care about it. They may be well-intentioned, but they certainly care about the bottom line, and they know that this is an important contributor. I have not had one investor challenge me on our diversity or our environmental efforts. Not a single investor has said to me, I'm concerned about you spending money or time on that. They're happy to see us do that. They love to see us do that. They just don't want to feel like it's coming at their expense, and I don't think it needs to.
Okay, we've got a question in the back.
Hello. My name is Reka. I'm from the Brooklyn Fashion Design Accelerator, which is part of Pratt Institute. My question is that Etsy has done such an amazing job of democratizing market access for millions of artisans around the globe. But there are several, million of artisans that still need that.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest challenges is logistics.
Yeah.
Just the act of getting stuff in and out of a remote rural place.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have any initiatives around that. And the second part of the question is, how are you distinguishing mass market merchandise on Etsy's platform so buyers have, confidence that they're buying handmade stuff?
Yeah, great questions and things we think a lot about. So we have an initiative right now in India as one example where there's an amazing tradition of artisanship and craft and a great opportunity to access the market. And again, making the pie bigger for everyone. The first thing we observed is that when buyers buy something from a maker in India, their purchases go up. So they're having great experiences. They're buying things that they probably wouldn't have found anywhere else. And that's really exciting. It's not obvious that everyone in India understands Etsy or has access to Etsy or knows how to use Etsy. It's also not clear to us that the labor practices will always be great. How do you know that this is a really great artisanal experience versus some really horrific factory things that we, with really unsafe labor practices that we all have tragically read about. And so we have a small team in India, and this is possible in India. It's not possible in higher cost labor markets, but we have a team of really talented people on mopeds that go to different villages in India and are training artisans. And there's a couple of things that they're able to do then. They're able to actually meet and train the artisans on how to get up and running on the Etsy platform. They're also able to inspect and make sure that the labor practices are in fact safe and things that we're proud to support. So we're excited about that experiment. It's going well, and we'll see how it tracks. The second part of your question was logistics, and we signed deals with logistics providers, and we need to do more of those in the developing world to make that easier for people.
We're out of time. So Josh, I want to thank you. This has been very inspiring.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the support.
And everyone, we have sessions starting now, so we'll meet back here at lunchtime. Thank you.